Interesting here in this interview with Chris Eubank Jr., he was speaking on the interview with Chris Eubank Jr., he was speaking on the Conor Benn situation, and he revealed, or at least confirmed, that when he found out about Conor Benn's second failed test, he hadn't been told about the first test. So Team Ben concealed that from him, concealed that from his whole team, presumably, including his promoter Sauerland. Now, people previously, when I was speculating about this, said, well, perhaps Ben had no legal obligation to tell Eubank about the first failed test because that was under the clean boxing program, whereas the second failed test was part of this contract with Chris Eubank Jr. And that may well be the case, but shouldn't you at least do the opponent the professional courtesy, particularly the likes of Eddie Hearn, but even more so Conor Benn, do Eubank Jr. the professional courtesy of telling him that you failed a test several weeks previous? Because that could be a game changer. That could be a thing where, okay, Eubank Jr. is informed about you failing one test and he's still willing to go ahead with a fight. But if he'd had knowledge of a previous failed test, because, one failed test, you might say, okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you didn't take anything intentionally. But if he had knowledge that you'd failed a few weeks previous as well, then maybe he'd be thinking differently, like, nah, this fight can't go ahead. Or I'm not going to come in at the contracted weight since you failed 2 tests. You see it? So yeah, very interesting that Eubank Jr. confirmed that he was only told about 10 days prior to when the fight was supposed to happen about the second failed test, not the first one. Also, in this interview, he says that Conor Benn should just come out, hold his hands up, and admit that he's guilty, even if he's not guilty. He worded it, as you can see in the title, he said, even if you're not guilty, you're still guilty in the eyes of the public. So he thinks that by carrying on the way he's carrying on, Ben that is, and staying silent and only coming out to talk about contamination and all this and whatever, by carrying on like that, the public are just going to stay angry at him. Whereas if he comes out and apologizes and, says he's guilty, they might actually forgive him in the long run. I understand the angle Eubank Jr. is coming from, because even if Conor Benn is exonerated somehow by the WBC or by the British Boxing Board of Control, he's still going to have that black cloud hanging over him, for sure. The public, certainly a lot of my subscribers, are not going to buy any kind of exoneration, many of them. So if he showed some humility and put his hands up and apologized, would it make it less bad for him in the short term or long term? I don't know. It's kind of like in the legal system, certainly in America, where people who don't have enough money for good legal representation and they get hit with charges for something they didn't do. And by the way, I'm not saying Conor Benn is innocent. I'm just giving you a hypothetical scenario here. Somebody charged with something they didn't do. They don't have the money to pay for the right legal representation to prove that they're innocent. So they take a plea deal, which the vast majority of people, to my understanding in the United States, that's what they do. They take plea deals, they cop out to the charge and agree to do a certain amount of time. That is rather than going to court, trying to fight it with a public defender, which they're usually terrible, fight it with a public defender, and if you get found guilty, you're going to get some crazy sentence. So rather than a crazy sentence, they just plead guilty, take a plea deal, and get a much shorter sentence than they would if they were found guilty on trial. So there are people languishing in prisons for things they didn't do because they just weren't able to prove their innocence, right? But those people are in a situation where a court has a tremendous amount of power over them. The public do not have the same amount of power, right? The court of public opinion doesn't have the same amount of power over Conor Benn as actual courts do over prisoners. So
I don't think it's necessarily the best thing for Conor Benn to do if he's innocent, and I'm not saying he is, if he's innocent, to come out and say, oh yeah, hold my hands up, I'm guilty. Because if he can get cleared, then he's free to fight. And one thing I'll say about the public, not just regarding boxing, but in general, they have very short memories. In order for them to remember anything, they have to be constantly reminded about it on at least a yearly basis, if not monthly basis or weekly basis. They have to be constantly reminded about something over and over and over and over and over again to drill it into their heads, or else they forget very, very quickly. So with Conor Benn, let's say he serves a ban or gets exonerated, whatever. If he goes in there, fights and beats one of the top American fighters, again, I'm not saying he can, but in a hypothetical scenario, let's say he comes back, fights in the United States against Virgil Ortiz and beats him, yeah? Would the British public still be desperately upset with him, not want to watch his fights? Or would it all be water under the bridge, forgive and forget, kiss and make up? I suggest it would be more so the latter, especially if Conor Benn showed a tremendous amount of heart and resilience in beating someone like a Virgil Ortiz, because of course, there's always the old, over the Atlantic rivalry between the British and the Americans when it comes to sport. And if the British were able to get one up, their young welterweight going up against one of the top American welterweights, I think a lot of the British public would forgive and forget and they'd, get behind Conor Benn all over again. So, yeah, that's how easy redemption can be in a sport like boxing. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about what Chris Eubank Jr. said in this interview regarding the test. And let me know what you think about what he said regarding Conor Benn should just throw his hands up and say that he's guilty.